Welcome. Very excited today to be in conversation with Jagdeep Raina for Art in the Spotlight. Welcome, Jagdeep.
Thank you.
Before we begin our conversation and looking at Jagdeep's work and practice, I want to acknowledge that even within the digital space, the Art Gallery of Ontario operates on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. And the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Confederacy to peaceably care for the lands around the Great Lakes. This territory is also governed by a treaty between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the federal government. Toronto has always been a space for Indigenous activity, and we are very much still in the process of decolonizing spaces, including cultural institutions. And with that in mind, I want to introduce an amazing speaker, Jagdeep Raina. I will read your brief bio. Jagdeep is an artist and a writer based in Guelph, Ontario, where he teaches in the Department of Fine Arts and Music at U of Guelph. Raina holds an MFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design and has been an artist in residence in the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Madison, Maine, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts, the Camden Arts Centre Slade School of Fine Art in London, England, and the Miriam Dawood School of Art and Design in Lahore in Pakistan. Welcome, Jagdeep.
Thank you. It's really great to be here with you.
Where are we speaking to? Are you at home in Guelph at the moment?
I'm in Guelph, yes. I'm in my bedroom.
This is Jagdeep's first major talk, and I'm honored to be able to be in conversation with you. I've long admired your work. And as I bring up our first question, I want to remind the audience, please send questions through the chat and we will incorporate them. But I want to give you a little bit of a taste of Jagdeep's practice. So I'm just going to pull up some recent work. Give me 1 second. Jagdeep, can you see that as well?
Mm-hmm.
Jagdeep, your practice and work has ranged from painting and drawing to now textiles. This is an example of a recent textile piece you've done. You talk about the archives and migration and memory being great sources of your work. Can you tell us a little bit about this piece and what you're drawing on when you're looking at archival imagery?
Yeah, so I think with this piece in particular, it's coming from a series of works that I've been thinking about for a couple of years around the Green Revolution. So I guess I've really been thinking a lot about I think we're all kind of really seriously thinking about kind of conversations around climate justice and how that's intertwined into larger conversations around race and identity and diasporic history and historical memory. And something that I've been thinking a lot about is how to use the archive to look at ecological histories, environmental histories, and the way that even I guess diasporic communities, how they hold on to Indigenous environmental histories. And this project kind of came from that. I just in general, I've been really looking at the political landscapes of Kashmir and the political landscapes of Punjab, and then looking at it through kind of an ecological lens and kind of what's been happening there. And I just started reading a lot about the Green Revolution. I remember hearing about it when I was in my late teens, and that statistic always stood in my head, something going on where over 100,000 Punjabi farmers were taking their own lives because of what was happening to the land. And it really stayed with me. And then I kind of let that idea just simmer for a long time. And I eventually started a kind of a collaboration with a good friend of mine named Satinder Chauhan. She lives in London. She's a playwright. And she wrote a really beautiful play called Zameen, which is looking at a small family and kind of how their life kind of falls apart due to kind of the Green Revolution. And I guess just to give a brief context of the Green Revolution, it was an agricultural framework that was introduced to India after the partition. So around the late 1950s, early 1960s, and it kind of, the whole framework has kind of looked at how it's led to declining water tables and widespread soil erosion and low forest cover. And a lot of farmers are now being in debt because they're buying these kind of chemical cottons to kind of grow food at a more rapid rate. And it's kind of led to the destruction of a lot of traditional knowledge on farming and growing food. And
to farmer suicides.
And farmer suicides,
and
yeah.
I'm assuming what we're seeing here is maybe an image of a young farmer who has committed suicide, being held by his family with blood money woven into the tapestry, or I'm guessing is
that's exactly what it is, yeah.
Yeah.
And so Satinder, when she wrote the play, she spent I think uh, 2 intensive trips living with Punjabi farmers and like interviewing them and taking photos. And she kind of amassed this like really intense, beautiful archive as like, it has like 60 taped interviews with Punjabi family. It has like hundreds of photographs. And we hung out in London last year, and I was like telling her, I was like, I've always wanted to do a project around this. And eventually I was able to get a small grant, and I gave her funding to start taking over her archive. And so I've been drawing from that with the photographs.
And when you're drawing from archive, you're drawing mostly from photographic images. And
yeah,
I'm just going to go through a few more, maybe even more clearly. This one, Delicate Grief. Obviously, it looks like a Polaroid actually woven into the tapestry itself.
Yeah. It's all, I think that the kind of the desire with hand embroidery also kind of came, and the tapestries also started coming with kind of how rich these kind of handicrafts were, and like Punjabi culture, and like, the fulkaris and the embroideries. And so I kind of also drew from that as well. And I've been also kind of looking at a parallel history of the way in which kind of imperial and kind of colonial histories, the impact that they have on the textile industry in India too. So like the Kashmiri shawls and the, everything was once naturally dyed. All the silk that was used for the threads used to all come from Kashmir. So there was these like really organic trade routes. So I kind of started also kind of becoming really kind of obsessed with fulkaris, and like really realizing that this type of embroidery that came from these villages in Punjab was also kind of extinct in many ways. Like globalization has led to kind of the destruction of it. And after kind of, I guess England kind of relinquished control over India, and like India was a colonizer, also kind of really led to like the fulkari really being damaged too. So I started working with a woman from Pakistan, and started kind of learning as much of these kind of skill sets as I could. And eventually I've kind of become, I don't know, I feel really kind of passionate about kind of resurrecting the fulkari too. And then I kind of had this idea, like, why not start adding it as a border to these tapestries? So it kind of came from there. So I've been taking the photos and
ask you about your technique, and also about fulkari as a technique. But before we go there, when I first met you, you were very firmly ensconced in drawing and painting. And I wanted to show a few examples of that earlier work. For example, langar, and we'll come back to distributing langar. How did you talk about drawing being the mediator between all your art forms that ties it together? Can you explain that? And also, how did you make the transition from drawing and painting to tapestry?
Yeah, I mean, I think drawing is at the core of my practice in many ways. It's something that I always go back to, and I still try to like really stay rooted in drawing. And yeah, it's still a big part of my practice. And I even think about like textiles as a form of drawing too. Like instead of using a pencil or like a watercolor, I'm using a needle and thread. So I still feel like that the connection between shifting from drawing to painting, it's still rooted in drawing in many ways. And there is something really kind of nice about kind of working with material that's also very light. And I'm interested in this idea of fragility. I feel like this material is very fragile. The tapestries are not that heavy. They're really they're on my bed. They're not that heavy, and they have a similar kind of echoes of fragility that a lot of kind of the archival sources that I work from echoes too. So there's constantly this need of like resurrection that I'm always thinking about, whether it's like resurrecting a lost history or resurrecting kind of a forgotten type of material, and then kind of juxtaposing that with like a material that also is very fragile, to give it more permanence. I think that makes sense.
What is the relationship between migration and memory in your work? And I also want to ask you, this is going back a little bit to an article you did in Rung magazine.
Oh yeah.
You spent time with the film director Gurinder Chadha in London, and it sounded like the documentary that she did, I'm British, but ... Is that?
Yeah.
Was a great influence in you starting to look into kind of hidden histories and South Asian diasporas, whether they're in London or Canada or the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the root of your work in terms of that theme?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Well, I remember watching the documentary when I was a teenager, and it kind of blew my mind, because I feel like, I think sometimes I'm constantly critical of, like, about like, not like specifically my generation, but like more in terms of like, there's always this kind of need to think that like something that I'm doing, like I'm the first one that's doing it, or like I'm kind of a pioneer in this, but that's always not true. There's always been like a generation of artists that have come before you, and I've been thinking about the same things that you've been thinking about, and kind of doing the same things that you've been doing, maybe if it's in a different medium. And I remember watching that film. I'm like, everything that these people are talking about in this film, this was like 20 years ago, and like I feel really connected to it. And I guess it's kind of, there is something about like looking at the past. It's really humbling because it helps you realize that there's like you're part of this like huge tapestry of like artists who have been doing and thinking about the things that you've been thinking about, whether even if it's through like a different medium. And I love kind of using the archive as a way to kind of bridge these kind of historical gaps. And it helps me also kind of build an intergenerational community of artists too. And it's cool because when I was interviewing Grinder, she was like, at that time, like, I didn't really think what I was making was so radical. I just wanted to like make a film about my friends dancing. And then like, now, and then she was like, having you talk to me about it, and like the way that you talk about it is like putting it in a historical context. Like that's one of the only records of that time that now exists. And I remember like feeling really kind of struck by that. And this idea of like, the past is always something, sometimes it's like a skeleton in your closet and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just something beautiful that's just sitting there, but there's always this need to constantly be in dialogue with kind of things that have come before you. And, yeah.
And I think, it's interesting, Jagdeep, and we don't have an example of that work here. It's an image of I think, Piccadilly Circus in the 80s. But you talk about time being cyclical, and what you're referring to in terms of that documentary is 1980s London, and specifically like acute racism in 1980s London. And you recently said in an interview that 2016 onwards and Trump's election and the shift back to kind of fascist fundamentalism has reawoken those images of 80s London for you. What is your relationship between your practice and social justice now, especially in the last 2 months? I mean, very politically astute, and you're documenting time and space, especially around South Asian diaspora. That as a POC artist, what do you feel your role is in this moment?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think my role is just kind of continuing to act as like a documenter of like this current moment, and also kind of historical moments. Like this is a project that I'm really proud of. I made a series of paintings with the Self-Help Black Sisters, and they've been doing like groundbreaking work in London for like over 40 years, where they've been kind of helping, looking at issues of like domestic violence and fundamentalism in England. And I spent time like going through their archives and their photos and their films and transcribing material. And I'd made a series of these paintings, and then I gave it to them, and they turned it into these postcards, and then like all proceeds went to SBS. It's like a project I'm really proud of. And so it's like something I'm constantly thinking about, like the role visual art can play in kind of these movements. And I think for me, I like kind of thinking about kind of what's happening now with kind of historically what's been happening. And like Devyani, as you said, like when I was in London, like and thinking about that documentary, like it had come out in a time when like nationalism was fading, and then when I got there, Brexit had just happened. So I was like, what's going on? So like it really kind of I think it kind of reaffirms that like my role in like these movements is somebody who's kind of interested in what's been happening on the ground right now, but at the same time also what's been happening in the past, and kind of like linking the two together and thinking about visual art and writing as a way to like link the two together.
You have a BFA, but you also have a degree in English literature from Western, and you describe yourself as a storyteller, which I personally loved in terms of the intersections in your practice. Are you doing any writing right now as well?
I am. I just finished the rough draft of my poetry book, which I'm super excited about. And I'm 6 chapters into a short novel that I'm writing. And I just started taking like fiction writing classes on and off over the last couple of years. And then, I mean, it was always at the back of my head. And even in grad school, I was doing like like creative writing seminars. And then I really feel like this year I was like, okay, I'm going to like really do it. So those are 2 writing projects that are
working on
cooking. Yeah.
You're sitting at your home in Guelph, I'm assuming. And you just had your first, in the last 2 years, first solo exhibitions in terms of, it was Peel and the University of Guelph, correct?
Yeah.
Tell us about kind of Guelph's influence on you and the importance of regionalism in the Canadian newcomer narrative, because I think your family were one of the first Punjabi Sikh families in Southern Ontario. When did they arrive? And we've been so city-centric historically, especially in the Toronto arts scene. Obviously, there's a huge revitalization around stories from the inner suburbs and the outer suburbs. How do you situate yourself? And I think it's really exciting that you've been narrating the diaspora within the Guelph context.
Yeah. Yeah, my family has like really deep rooted kind of ties to Guelph. My uncle came here in 1965. He did his master's and PhD at the University of Guelph. He, yeah, like he got married here in the 60s. And like, I think there was literally like nobody. I think he was one of the first like South Asians in Ontario, actually. There really wasn't that many. And then yeah, and then he just kind of stayed, and then eventually like in the early 70s he started coming, like bringing over his brothers, and then my mom was really young when she came over in the mid 70s. And it's funny, kind of everyone has kind of siphoned off, like people have gone to like Toronto, Brampton, even like the United States, like everyone has gone all over the place, but somehow like we just stayed in Guelph. I don't know why. So we kind of just stayed, and it's always just been our family and then my uncle's family, and his kids are like over 20 years older than me, but they're really, I'm really close with them because I guess my mom kind of lived with them and helped kind of raise them. So they have really interesting stories too, of like growing up and going to high school here in the 80s and going to University of Guelph, and their experiences and those stories is kind of what kind of made me start thinking about these histories. And then my uncle also lived through the partition, like many, many, many other families. He lived through it in Kashmir in October, and like I always thought that experience was also very necessary for me to document. And then when I started interviewing him about that, it eventually then kind of those Guelph stories started coming, and I just realized that there was so much that I didn't know around migration and multiple migrations and how to start thinking about that.
How they interact. And what we're
Yeah.
looking at now, Lunger, my sense is your early documentation, is this kind of the Guelph Brampton Sikh community
Yeah.
within the temple network.
Yeah. These are two pieces that were up on display at the Guelph exhibition and PAMA too. And yeah, I think that's something I've also been thinking a lot about in my work too, is ideas of like seva, which means like selfless service, and this idea of like, I guess like humility, like kind of how that kind of weaves. It's like how it's like a something that's like weaving in itself, weaving in and out of this community that like I kind of come from. And Lunger is such a big part of that, because it's like, every Sundays you go and like you cook food for the community, and it's something that like so many of us kind of grew up around. And I was always thinking about like how to capture that through visual art. So I kind of wanted to create these two visceral scenes, one of the people preparing the food, one of the people distributing the food. And then I think about that in my kind of own lens as an artist, like how can that thread of like Lunger or seva kind of translate itself into the work I'm doing. So I guess I see this project as like a seva collaboration. Or
For those who don't know it, can you explain seva?
yeah, so seva just means selfless service. So it just means kind of giving back and like not really expecting anything in return. And it's just like a concept that like the older I get, the more kind of I'm drawn to. And I think there's like something very mystical about it, and very like just, I don't know, very awe-inspiring. And also how that's tied into this idea of labor. Like these people are spending hours and hours and hours like every day for decades and decades building a community with their blood, sweat, and tears. And how that labor often goes acknowledged, especially with this one, which is like thinking a lot about gender too, and how that is something that sometimes isn't kind of.
These are all women.
Yeah, it's all women. Yeah, so that was a very conscious decision. Yeah.
But Jagdeep, if I can reveal, when I first met you and you were working out of your home, you were unrolling canvases in your living room. You were one of the 25 Sobey Art Award recipients this year. You've obviously had 2 solo shows. You're represented. How has that changed your practice in terms of as you enter the market, in essence, and a more popular awareness of your work?
It's a great question. I think it's like made me more shy. I think, I don't know. It's like made me want to just like cling to my art and just be like, okay, like, I don't know. Hopefully people like it, and try to just kind of put my head down, like really focus on the work. And there's a great quote that I always go back to by Adrian Piper. She talks about kind of the role that money plays in her practice as an artist. And she's like, if your work starts selling, or like when it starts getting kind of commercial recognition, there's still a way that you can try to go back to like that core of what it is to be an artist, is like, which is kind of like, think about just your work first. Like nothing matters, like all this external stuff, it's nice, and like it's really cool that like people are kind of getting recognition for their work, but one should never let those things kind of interfere with why you became an artist in the first place, which is like to tell stories and to kind of share those stories. And so I think that like I feel like I'm becoming more and more like aware of just like staying like really making sure that the most important thing is the work. And like the other funny thing is, it's like every time like you know, there's many artists can speak to this. Like whenever we as artists, whenever we get something, whether it's like it's an award or like a show, behind that like accomplishment, there's like 1,000 rejections. So it's like that's also something I think about too. Like even just in this year alone, I think I've gotten like 6 or 7 rejections from things I've applied to, and then other things start coming up. So it's constantly like it's really nice actually, because like the rejections are they really ground you. They make you realize like you know, like opportunities that do come, you know, that is all exciting, but also to just realize that like, you know, you're constantly, artists should constantly be living and working from a place of like realizing how little they know and like operate from that. And then I think from that you can kind of keep your head on straight.
Centered.
Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing that, because you know, this has been probably a decade of your trajectory that has evolved, and it changes people, and it provides opportunity, but it also, as you said, can sideline folks. So it's nice to hear how you maintain centeredness. I just want to remind people who are watching, please ask questions, and we'd love to hear from you as well. And Jagdeep, I want to talk to you a little bit more about technique, but before we go there, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and I'm wondering how you have been during this time and how you have been working, and has it actually influenced any of the projects you're currently working on? You were showing the postcards. What are you working on now?
Yeah, so the pandemic it influenced my teaching practice a little bit. It was my first time kind of starting my trajectory as a teacher, and that was a bit kind of tricky to navigate, especially because I was teaching 4th year students, so the thesis class. So we were getting ready for their final exhibition. I invited some local artists from Toronto, Tristram Lansdowne, and then a curator from Hamilton, Danica Evering, to come. And it really kind of, it really taught me how to like when these things happen in a pedagogical way, how to think about that. And then I guess in terms of my artistic practice, I had a studio in downtown Guelph that I left the building, and then I've been working out of a room downstairs. I think creatively, I feel very like creatively, I haven't felt too kind of bogged down by the pandemic. I feel very like creatively, my juices have been flowing. It's been pretty productive. I've been working on paintings, and my first short film I finished, and the writing and the textiles. And so there's something about like living in this kind of intense time that we're all in, where I think for me, like it's kind of felt like an adrenaline rush. Like it hasn't, I just feel like there's so much work to do. And so I've been kind of really just like, you know, feeling it all into my practice. Working. Yeah, exactly.
We have a question from Hina Mystery. Can you talk more about the novel you're working on, what it is about?
Yeah, so the novel, it sounds kind of corny, but it's going to be a love story, and it's set in the 1930s, and that's all I'm going to say.
I like the cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And quickly back to technique. You're embroidering by hand, and where did you learn this? You were in residence in Pakistan, and I mean that is fine, detailed work along with the pukari, and very curious about how long it takes you to create a tapestry.
It takes pretty long. I have, I'm not sure if I have them here, but I have them here, but they're kind of over there, so. They take a long time. Like I think it depends. Like the one of the spinning wheel took about that one took about 2 months, and then this one took about like the details, and that one probably took about like a month. And I learned the technique from half of like from family, and then the other half just taking workshops in Toronto. So the textile studio, I took a bunch of workshops there. The workroom, I took a bunch of workshops there. Unit on, was it Bloor? I took some workshops there.
So you're completely self-taught.
Yeah. It felt really, I did one little like embroidery independent study in grad school because RISD had an amazing textiles program, and so I did a little bit there, and then it was just always at the back of my head. And also just like I'm really, really privileged because in my house I have a Kashmiri shawl that's over 200 years old. It's something that I've always been looking at, and I think our house has had a lot of embroidery and textiles from Kashmir, so I've always been around it.
You've been seeing it in situ
my whole life, yeah. And then also like making appointments to the ROM, like to Polly Dewan, introduced me to the amazing collections there, and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I spent some time there. They have an amazing collection of Fulgaris, and there's one more institution I went to. I can't remember now. Oh, the RISD Museum. I worked at the museum when I was a grad student there, and they had a couple of Kashmiri shawls too. So it was constantly around it. And then like this the last 2 years, I was like, I'm just gonna do it. Like I really want to like learn this. And so weaving and embroidery and sewing, and then natural dye and spinning. Those are the three that I'm working on. So this is a little bit like my spindle and some
Thank
stuff
you
I've been
for showing
like,
us. It's nice to be in your studio.
Yeah. And my dream is like to make a big Fulgari from scratch.
Is that a traditional spindle? Like a hand loom?
It is. It's really old. And then I have an old embroidery hoop that's like over there. It's like on the other side of my room. And then I just have like, and also I think there's just such a history of like textiles is such a big part of like the material culture of like South Asian families, like whether you're from any part of the region that you're from. And because my family's from Kashmir, like, and then the geographical connection that we have to Punjab, like there's the Kashmir shawl and the Fulgari are just, those are like kind of the two main ones that I've always been interested in. And both also have a very dark history in terms of like what happened to the Kashmir shawl, the way that the industry was really exploited by the French, by how the partition affected the Fulgari. So they have dark histories, globalization, and it's really kind of intense to kind of do a lot of reading around it.
May not know. Can you explain what the Fulgari technique is? It's it's under the end. Maybe just you had a piece. I think it was Punjabi birds. Is that in your hand?
I have that one. And I also have this, which is right here too. This is a really, really, really old Fulgari. So it's called flower work. And so full means flower, kari means work.
Flower.
And it's just the darning stitches, the different types of stitches. It's very geometric. Like it's a geometric way of needlework. So it's like you really kind of you work from the back. You use silk thread for it, and then the fabric is cotton. So I've studied this like a lot, and just my friend just bought me a book about the Fulgari, which I've been obsessed with and studying that. And then the Kashmir shawl, the embroidery in this one is a bit different. It's but you can see just a little bit of it. They have something called the paisley, which is it's like a teardrop symbol. It's like right there.
Call it
Ambi, but it's called the paisley now because when the French, and the Scottish they were kind of messing with the industry, they kind of renamed it. But the original name was Ambi, AMBI, and it was the symbol was meant to be the tree of life. Yeah. So there's all these histories that keep coming up, and I'm constantly thinking about, it's kind of how I've been.
It's interesting, and then I'm going to take some questions from the audience because I'm dominating the time. Sorry everyone watching. I'm just very excited to talk to Jagdeep.
Also, this book is really great too. It's embroidered fragments from Kashmir. Yeah.
Cool. You talk about history and memory, and then you self-profess that as a millennial, you are very much learning to, as you said, not ignore that in the 80s there was South Asian movements in Toronto and organizations fighting for social justice. So I'm wondering, who are your mentors and who do you look to in this kind of continuum around?
There's so many, like, oh my gosh, it's hard to, there's a lot. There's a lot of artists that I guess I'll start with artists. Like when I was in grad school, I was lucky enough to be there when this program called the Kirloskar program was happening. So they were offering contemporary South Asian art classes. So like my timing there was very karmic. And so Chitra Ganesh was a professor of mine, Courtney J. Martin, who runs the Yale Center for British Art. They were offering really cool classes like Art After India and Contemporary South Asian Art, worked with the Roxy Media Collective. And then a lot of the artists like Kara Walker, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Carrie James Marshall, Adrienne Piper, Emily Jasir. She's a Palestinian artist whose work I really love a lot. A lot of the writers who've inspired me. Gosh, there's so many. I'm really.
No, it's good. It just gives us.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Is that your book
Family members, it's everybody. Filmmakers,
A question from Elwood Jimmy. Elwood asks, does the shift in making from drawing to weaving / embroidery change your relationship to the history and narrative you are documenting? There's a shift in in the mode of production change your relationship to the
Yeah,
narrative?
I think specifically with weaving and embroidery, I'm really the narrative that for me is changing is becoming more attuned to kind of the legacies of kind of colonial and imperial practices and how they affected textiles in South Asia. So like learning about that history has been like at the back of my head. Um, and it's something that I'm like really kind of haunted by. Um, and I think specifically working in textiles, and I'm specifically determined to learn as much as I can about North Indian textiles, the history behind that, whether that history, you know, the darker parts of that history is something that I'm really kind of trying to dig deeper into and not to gloss over.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
yeah,
amazing because it's actually physically within the works themselves and also within
yeah,
your intention.
yeah,
I'm going to just do a few more.
yeah.
Paul Kajender asked, can you talk about tactility and care intimacy in relation to your process? He goes on to say, it strikes me that your use of the archive is personal and connected to relations and collaborative action. In a moment where proximity, because I guess COVID is challenged, how has your sense of touch, embroideries, drawings changed?
It's a good question.
Great question.
How's my sense of touch changed? Um, I think I'm more aware of um, kind of subverting this idea of like fragility with this work and how even though the mediums that I work with are very fragile, and there's a constant need to kind of monitor that. I'm constantly thinking about like how types of materials that do seem fragile, how I can think about it in a sense of like making it more robust or more permanent, or like giving something with fragility more sturdiness. And I think thinking about the permanence of these things has allowed me to kind of care about them more, and like has allowed me to realize that like these are things that like I want these things to have a life. Like hopefully like, you know, 60 years from now, 100 years from now, when they exist, like they can be out there and living. And so I think like, yeah, I think I'm thinking about touch through this idea of permanence, and like realizing that making this isn't like I want to kind of uh, like have it kind of be a part of an ongoing conversation long after I'm gone is something that like I'm really thinking about more seriously. So
Mm.
touch as something that can be more permanent, because I think for me like I've always been kind of, I think I've always worked in a very careless manner in the sense that like I'm very like I'm very relaxed when I work. Like there's stuff everywhere, there's thread everywhere. Like I'm always kind of working in a very kind of like careless way. My studio is always messy. There's always like thread everywhere. And I really feel like in this COVID time, like maybe not having a studio and like I'm really realizing that like I'm trying to like um, work in a more careful way too, and that has allowed me to think about this idea of like care and touch and permanence. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what is happening in this image, in this work, and its title? And I'm assuming it is a historical banner that says, there's a historical banner that says Filthy Imperial Glory.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've superimposed that. It looks like a gate that could be Pakistan or North India.
Yeah. So this is a gate that I came across when I went to Lahore. It's called the Kashmir Gate, and it was like the old city used to have these ancient gates that would lead to like the various parts of like India before it was divided. And this gate, a lot of during kind of British rule, a lot of the gates were torn down by the Brits, but this gate somehow didn't. It's like it's still standing there. And this is the gateway to Kashmir, and I felt like very kind of hypnotized by this gate. I kept going there over and over again because I realized like once upon a time, like this gate would have gone right to my grandfather's village, literally right where he used to live before he had to flee to the other side of the border. So like I was really obsessed with this gate. I kept going there. I made a film about it. I like took photographs. I did a painting of it, and then I wanted to create like a tapestry of it. And then kind of that's where that title came from, like Filthy Imperial Glory. Just thinking about like just like the centuries of like imperialism that have like affected Kashmir through many different people, not just the French, not just the British, but the Afghans, even like the Sikhs, and really thinking about this land as something that is constantly being pulled at.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where like the title came from. And then I created a Fulkari border. The first part comes from like a traditional Fulkari called Sanchi, which is like embroidered during times of like weddings, and it's very lively. And so I made like a Fulkari pattern from that of like a horse-drawn carriage. And I was just kind of imagining like ornate rulers like going to Kashmir and they're in these like silk lavish kind of carriages. And then the bottom of the embroidery was me imagining like the motorcycles that I was seeing of people going to the gate now. And then I also try to do that in like a Fulgari pattern, and then the border. So this piece, yeah, it's part of a larger series that I've just been doing around this gate. I've written a poem around it, and the textile, a painting, and a short film. So it's something that, just ideas that have been kind of percolating.
It feels like a lot of your recent images are actually more to do with South Asia itself in terms of depiction. I'm assuming fields as well. Have you moved away from the North American context, or are you planning to go back there? You've talked about yourself as almost like experiencing the immigration newcomerness that your parents did in the 70s in Canada as someone living in the United States when you went to RISD, or in London, maybe when you were also in Lahore. Where is your geographical focus right now?
So yeah, that's a great question. The Green Revolution project that I'm working on, that is very much centering me on Indian Punjab. And then I really want to do a project around the Kashmir shawl, which my goal is to go there for like a year if I can, and live with Kashmiri weavers and like learn more about the craft and like learn the craft. And so I think that project is eventually going to take me to Kashmir. And then there's always other projects I have cooking in my head. I want to do another project around the UK where I really want to look at the history of queer South Asian histories that's been kind of documented there over the last 30 years, 40 years. I've been spending time with Pratibha Parmar's films and Parminder Sekhan and Palomi Desai and Shakil Aman. And so I feel like right now, I also want to start looking at the farm worker movements that were happening in BC, their right to kind of unionize. So kind of, I guess right now I'm in a bit of geographically, I'm in a bit of a triangle. I'm looking at the UK again. I'm looking at the global South, particularly Kashmir, and then wrapping up the work I want to do on the Green Revolution. And then I also want to start looking at BC and some of the.
Have you ever explored the BC context? Because it's so fascinating. I had the opportunity of going to the first Sikh temple in North America, which is in Golden, when it was a lumber community in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've crossed paths with Naveen Giran, who's
Manjot,
yeah, exactly.
My entire thesis was all about that stuff. I think I made ended up making almost like 100 paintings around like BC. And then I had an exhibition in California in 2017, which was looking at the first Gurdwara in BC, how it was torn down and how there's like condominiums there. So I was really exploring that history like in grad school, like 2014, 15, 16. And then the Sikh Heritage Museum in BC, that's at the old temple, they did like a small show. Manjot and Naveen kind of were there too. And but that was like 2016, 17, 18. And then so in the last 2 or 3 years, I haven't looked at BC, but now that I want to relook at it again, I'm thinking a lot about the histories of the farm worker movements and seeing what kind of intersections that has with like those early migrant histories too. So this idea of constantly living in a cycle, like just when you think that you're kind of finished with one project and then you find yourself revisiting it over and over again, that's kind of something that I'm always thinking about too. Yeah.
Which I think is amazing about what you're doing. I'm going to take a few more questions from the audience. Simranpreet Anand asks, how do you find cultural connection, viewership, and interest in a diasporic community that is so underrepresented and sometimes disinterested within the Canadian art context? So how do you find the cultural connection, viewership, and interest in the diasporic community that rightly so is so underrepresented within the Canadian art context?
I think how I've been able to find it is through just like being, I don't know, like really trying to immerse myself in like research. Like I think that like, I remember spending a lot of time in V-Tape and coming across a lot of cool stuff that was in there, like Pamela Matharu's work and Surinder Dhaliwal's work and Nisha Dosanjh's work, Ali Kazmi, and now even poets with Sharanpal Ruprai and Khalib Gill. And there's a really beautiful book that came out called Red Silk, Poetry by South Asian Women. So I think for me, like how I'm finding cultural connection is just like, I think just like, I don't know, like being nerdy about my research. Like I've always kind of been I've always been pretty kind of, as far as like I don't want to say annoying, but like I've always been kind of really like focused on this idea that there's all this stuff is out there and like I know what's out there and I just have to find it. And then like whether it's been like even emailing people or like reading stuff or making appointments. And so just kind of having this kind of research kind of based practice has always kind of made me realize that like even if the diasporic kind of communities and histories may seem underrepresented, that's never hindered South Asian artists or artists of color to still make work like that. Those history people have still made that work no matter what. And so it's like I realized like what I'm doing isn't really that new, like because like I'm just kind of contributing to a conversation because these people have always been doing that work, with specifically with looking at the Canadian art context. So I think, and also like also having like just like meeting and like having really great mentors. Like I've known Ali and so many other people that I've been talking to. Dipali really introduced me to so many people. And this is a poet I recently came across, Ritika Bazarani. Yeah, so just like knowing that these artists have been making that work in 30 years, 40 years, and just kind of finding their work has allowed me to like never feel lonely, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, it's not, you're held in hands and held in history.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I wonder, I think about this a lot right now, but I'd love your take on it. I mean, the role of the artist, the role of the curator in this moment where we're dealing with huge amounts of dismantling or attempts at dismantling white supremacy, whether it's in cultural spaces or within organizational spaces more widely. What do you feel curators, programmers, and artists need to be doing in this moment? And and that might be self-care, that might be just continuing your practice, it could be witness, but I'm curious to your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different things for different people, and like I think knowing that like I think for me it's like making the work, and also like the fact that like I was able to having the privilege to have these exhibitions. I'm constantly inviting people, whether it's like every time I have a show, I invite somebody to write a wall text for it. I organize a film screening, like the show that I had in Brampton. I invited 4 different South Asian women to come and present their work alongside mine during our opening, and similarly for my show at Cooper Cole, I invited another artist of color from the States to write a wall text, and for the show in Guelph, I invited 3 South Asian women to come and share their work alongside mine. So I think for me, thinking a lot about like making the work, but then also constantly building that community is like how I'm constantly thinking about like my role in all of this. And like there's this like quote that I always like. It's like really, I don't know, it's like really sweet. It's like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And like I'm always thinking about that.
It's an awesome quote, and I will take that to heart as well.
Yeah.
We have to wrap up, but I just want to say thank you so much for
thank you everybody for coming.
An honor to speak to you.
Yeah, you too.
Devyani
is really
for
great
a long time.
Yeah, it's really nice. And
take care, and thank you everyone for watching. And Jagdeep, I hope I can come see you soon with social distancing.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.